Good evening, everyone. First reminder, please, could we all turn our mobile phones off if we have them on, except council members, officers and members of the public are asked to leave the meeting if they wish to make or receive a telephone call. Could we also please refer to the pack page numbers rather than the report numbers? So if you plan to refer to a specific page in a report or appendix, please use the pack page number on the bottom right hand of the page rather than the report page number, as this helps to ensure that everyone can find the correct page quickly. Then please also note that this meeting is being filmed for live and subsequent broadcast via the Council's internet site. Generally, the public seating areas are not filmed. However, by entering the meeting room, you are consenting to being filmed and to the use of those images and sound recordings being used for the purpose described. The webcasting system uses the signal from the microphone system, so members are reminded to please use the microphones provided to ensure your contribution is recorded. Please also turn the microphone off again when you finish speaking. This meeting is a paperless meeting and there are a limited number of hard copy agendas available. If the fire alarm sounds, you are asked to leave the meeting by the nearest available exit, please. Our apologies for absence. Please, Ilona.
I have received apologies from Councillor Mario Creatura, Dave Harvey, Elaine Jones, Leah Morell and James Collins.
Thank you. Are there any more? Thank you. Minutes of the last meeting. Can we agree the minutes of the last meeting, please? Thank you. Disclosure of interest. The committee are asked to only disclose any interests that do not appear on their annual register of interest. If they do require at any point during the meeting to declare something, please just ask for a form or indicate with your hand. Urgent business, is there any? Exempt items?
There are none.
Thank you. So, children's social care. The report can be found on page 11 of the pack. And this is to be presented by Barbara Peacock, who's the Executive Director of People. Thank you, Barbara.
Well, I'm actually going to hand over to Ian Lewis very quickly, but I guess I'm going to just set a very brief context. This is a really important item for scrutiny and clearly a really important item for the whole council and for our children in Croydon. We take very seriously what we do in terms of improving outcomes for children and actually ensuring their safety and their well-being. You will hear as Ian presents his report a very concerted effort that we've been making over the past 6 months. As the new Executive Director, I have initiated a number of reviews, and you'll hear from Ian a sort of refresh focus in terms of where we're going, as well as some of the information about our indicative outturn for the end of the year. Actually, this scrutiny is critically important and plays a really valuable role in terms of making sure not only are we being open and transparent with you, but actually a really important contribution to improving the lives of our children. So I guess I'd like to set that as a context and then hand over smoothly to Ian.
Thank you, Ian.
Okay. Thank you very much. I won't be going into a full summary of the report but I'd just like to draw some key points, really. So, I mean, I think the overall context in which we're operating is, as I've been stated many times before, there's an overall rise in the population of Croydon and a rise in the number of children. So we have more children than any other London authority. But we're also seeing a rise in the rate of deprivation within our population, and that has an impact on demand on our services. As you know, Croydon has particular pressures that place demand on our services for children's social care. For example, the number of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children that we look after because of the presence of Lunar House, and the number of children placed within our area by other authorities. And that does lead to very high rates of missing children and very high rates of vulnerable adolescents living within Croydon. As I've put in the report, a joint targeted area inspection took place in May 2016, which focused on our front door, our MASH service, and on services to children at risk of sexual exploitation and who are going missing. The key issues are reproduced within this report and were presented to Cabinet last year. The action plan is overseen by the Safeguarding Children Board. And it's important to note that there were many positives raised by that inspection, as well as some of the issues that require improvement. For example, our work on unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, the leadership around children's child sexual exploitation and services within the Youth Offending Service. And as we've talked about this committee before, we are still awaiting a full inspection of children's social care by Ofsted. It will definitely happen before December 2017, because that's the final limit. So this will be the last time I'm telling you about a prospective inspection. I think within the report, as Barbara was saying, there have been a number of reviews, as well as the joint target area inspection, both by external reviewers and by our own internal audits, and that's generated a lot of work on the improvement plan and the development that we've done with staff and with young people of our new vision for early help and children's social care, and that vision is reproduced within the report. There are 6 key areas for the improvement plan, and that's overseen by Barbara as the Executive Director. The main themes are improving early help services, issues around the MASH and assessment service, our performance management and working on our data, the effectiveness of our use of data, practice improvement, especially around the core of our service. Engaging children, and again, part of the report shows on page 15 some of our work with young people and what they've told us they want from our services, and a confident and capable workforce. And those are the 6 themes of the improvement plan. Going forward, we're planning a management review and a realignment of our management to support the improvement plan in a number of ways. We're working hard to address those key performance issues that are around the quality of our service to children, and part of that is strengthening our quality assurance role. And I've mentioned Practice Week. Our first Practice Week was a really important step forward in how we look at the quality of our practice, and we'll be doing that on a 6-monthly basis, and in fact extending it to partners in May. We have a transformation plan around managing demand and achieving our savings and meeting the needs of children as early as possible. We have 3 applications to the Department of Education Innovation Fund, and all 3 have got through to the 2nd stage, which is a really good achievement to get to that stage. One is around commissioning for children's looked after placements. One is around targeted services for children in need, and the third is around improvements for care leavers. Going forward, we also have the regionalisation of adoption, proposals which came to Cabinet in January. But the really important thing that's core to what we want to sort of aim at is realising the vision. It's about improved outcomes for children and putting them at the heart of our practice and ensuring that we listen to their voices and the voices of their families in all that we do, and that everything is measured in terms of their outcomes.
Could I take questions then, please? Councillor Rendell, thank you.
Thanks. Just one quick question. There's a lot of mention of the police in the report. I think the best way to work is to build up relationships. Have we Have you or anyone else had meetings with the new borough commander team? We've got a new borough commander to, let them know our priorities and so we can work together, and I think a working relationship would be really good.
If I answer at the strategic level, and then Ian can give some more detail in terms of what's happening operationally. Yes, the new borough commander has been exceedingly positive in terms of reaching out and engaging with us, both the chief executive, Jonah Greenie, and myself as the new executive director of people, and we've had a number of really positive discussions, and he is clear of his role and the role of his team in terms of supporting us around not just community safety but also around safeguarding in this very particular sense and getting the best for our children. So absolutely yes.
Yeah, I mean, there are three main areas of our work. One is around children's child sexual exploitation, missing, gangs. We have very strong relationships with the borough police on those issues, and have worked very effectively at disrupting child sexual exploitation. We work very effectively in identifying where missing children are going missing, and as I said, the gangs work is a particular strength. The second area is around the MASH, and we are working closely with the police there in trying to manage the numbers of cases, and we started operating this week a new triage system, which is showing initial signs of improving the understanding of thresholds and what issues they need to give to children's social care. And the third area is the child abuse investigation team, and they're responsible for working with us on investigating allegations of around child protection and where criminal offences have been alleged or have been committed. And again, there's a strong relationship there, and there are ways in which we are able to escalate any issues, but there are close working relationships with that team, which works across. That's not just borough-based. That's across Croydon and Sutton.
Yes, please. Yes, Councillor Khan.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Page 41 of 70, 15.11. Ian, could you expand a bit more on that section, and the implications of it all, and what has the department done about some of those issues of concern?
There were two central concerns that the President raised. One was, in some cases, whether parents had genuinely consented to the use of Section 20. It arose out of his comments on his judgment on one particular case, but that has been used. It's been extrapolated and been used in quite a lot of case law. But his concern was that, in a sense, the parents have been offered either you agree or we'll take your children into care, and was that genuine consent? That paraphrases it considerably, but that was one of the concerns. The second concern has been about the duration of Section 20 arrangements, and whether that is meeting the human rights of the children to arrive at a final decision that is overseen by the courts, and whether they have been denied a human right by having the oversight of the court on their plan. That aspect has been slightly more contentious because it brings, to some extent you might say, it brings into question the issue of the no order principle, which was a central core principle of the Children Act 1989. And so what we've done is we have put into place a review of all of our cases on Section 20. We've instituted a new Section 20 procedure, which makes it clear that we need to review our consent on a regular basis with parents. Parents need to renew their consent at every looked after child review
and
be clear
Yeah.
that they understand what they are consenting to. It also means that we need to be clear that when we have a child under Section 20, we are undertaking active plans, and that children are not drifting in our care without a resolution either to return home or for some formal level of permanence.
And do we have, adequate resources to be carrying all that through? Because clearly it has impacted on additional resources, because you're having to do more work with the families and with the parents and to get it more right. So have we got the skills bank also within our resource base to be carrying those processes through in both a more effective manner, but equally the skills bank to be doing it all?
I suppose I'd give a view to my staff that's operating an effective and meaningful care plan is no more difficult than running an ineffective and drifting care plan, and no more time-consuming. And we do benefit from now a fully permanent team of independent reviewing officers who also give good challenge, but also advice and guidance to social work staff within the Looked After Children service. I think the resource pressure is primarily on the increase in care proceedings, and the changes in the court expectations around Section 20 does have some impact on the numbers of care proceedings, which have gone up considerably in the past year.
Yeah, that was also my concern. Yeah. Thank you.
Councillor Bennett, please.
It's on. I've got two comments to make. On item 216, I'm sorry, we haven't got a pack number on this. There's no number at the bottom. It's about the pressures on children's social care, and it's children in need, and the pressure in this area has been driven up. It says assessment up by 80% year on year. I don't know whether that's a question or a comment, or whether you'd like to comment on the reason for this, or, I mean, it seems an enormous...
And could I also add something to that to your question then, if you don't mind?
Yeah.
Because percentages are not always clear, because sometimes it could mean there's probably 3 children or something, or 5 children, and then the percentage seems huge if suddenly one, this and that happens. You know, sort of, no, but I'm just giving an exaggerated example to make the point. But so could you give us some idea of what the numbers are as well, so that, if it's what the percentage is, how relevant that is, and, how many children would be involved in that. I think that's also...
I think that's right, because that happened last time. We went to something like from 3 to 5, and it was an enormous... Yes. So I don't know if you just want to comment on that.
I don't have the specific numbers in front of me, but we're talking about in the order of hundreds. So,
right, so we are talking about a significant amount, yes.
Yes, significant numbers of allocated child in need cases. That essentially peaked in the 2015-16 year. Right. We have worked, it maintained through the first 9 months of this year. The number in the last 2 months, we've been working hard to get that number down, and it's down from 800 to around 600. As I say, I don't have the specific figures, but so it has the numbers of children have come down. To explain, children in need are cases that are allocated to a social worker. They've been through the assessment and been assessed to require an ongoing social work service, but they're not those that have met the threshold for a child protection case conference. So they have a significant level of need, but they do not require a child protection plan. So those are the cases that we're talking about. The numbers of assessments during the year have been reducing. The pressure on the budget is also partially driven. The budget for care proceedings that I mentioned is also held within this area, and that's not just legal costs, but there will be, in most care proceedings, there are orders for additional assessments, often by third-party organisations or psychiatrists or psychologists, and that has also been a feature of the pressures on the budget in this year. But it's been ongoing from the rise that took place during 2015-16.
Saying that you've got 600 children that still need to be assessed, that have been identified and need to be assessed.
No, 600 children who are allocated, who have been assessed,
who
are allocated to a social worker.
I was going to say,
as
that would be quite worrying if there were 600 children waiting. Right, it's item 3.3 about the 10 messages from children. And what struck me was the 10. It said, be a stable person in my life. Now, I know that you have a turnover of social workers. I know that this is a difficult area, and I just wondered how this, I mean, because it seems such an important thing, and it's obviously an important thing to these children, and I wondered how you could cope with that and how well that works, if you can have the same ongoing social worker.
I think there are two ways there are a number of factors here. One is the turnover of staff. The record on the turnover of permanent staff from a point sort of 4 years ago, where Croydon was actually the worst performing in the United Kingdom. We are now down below the London average, but that's 15% per year over turnover, which is still too many. But that is permanent staff. On top of that, around 20% of our staff are agency staff, and we have less of a measure of our turnover, and there is a turnover amongst our agency staff. So children do experience changes in social workers which are driven by the turnover of staff. And part of our, as I said, our improvement plan is around recruitment and retention. It's a perennial issue that we've discussed at this scrutiny panel on many occasions. And so, I mean, we may go on to a specific issue around that. The other thing that we can do more about is that changes in social worker happen because of some of our internal processes. So part of, as I mentioned before, looking at the management review is actually considering what is it around the way our service is organised that can reduce our sort of, if you like, changes in social worker which are dictated by our processes, and because that's something that we can control. It's worth saying there are other stable people in children's lives, and foster carers are one of them. If children are looked after, it is directed at social workers. Social workers and other professionals, so people like youth offending workers.
In their life, which they normally do, to see a different social worker is difficult, and I do understand what the problems are, but it's something that you obviously are aware. So I don't know how many cases your social workers hold that they can, because I know that in other services, if you don't have the same social worker, but in children's services, I hope that it's different. I listen to what you say, and you are hopefully working towards that as best as you can. There's something that you've identified.
It's certainly an issue, and as I said, there are two ways in which we're seeking to address that. One is further work on recruitment and most importantly retention of staff once we've recruited them. And the second is in reducing our internal processes that dictate changes of staff because of our processes rather than the needs of the child.
Councillor Bird, please.
Thank you. 6.91, the areas for improvement and the targeted review. The MASH is experiencing high and increasing levels of demand, and the inspectors found systems and capacity issues. Are they being addressed?
Yeah.
I was going to bring back a very similar point from just on top of the inconsistency in the thresholds in the same paragraph was I highlighted as being a concern as well.
Could you take both of those, please? Thank you.
The MASH does experience high levels of demand, and those high levels of demand have continued. There is a relationship between the thresholds, and I'll do my best to come on to that. In terms of the capacity, we have increased the capacity within the MASH, and that's both from children's social care, but also the police and health partners have increased their representation within the, because it's the multi-agency safeguarding hub. We've increased the management as well, and the management oversight. So that what we've additionally done is we've got a much greater suite of performance indicators, and so managers see how many cases have gone through and where they're getting information after the event, but they can also see live information about where cases are being held as they progress through the system within the MASH. So there's greater management oversight, and I'm confident that our ability to meet the current demand is there. We have no backlogs within the MASH, and cases are being dealt with promptly. The second issue is how we try to reduce that demand, because at this stage too many of those cases, and that is related to the understanding and application of thresholds by our partners. Too many of those cases are being closed down with no further action, so that is a lot of activity that may not have been required. It's important to see within the MASH that they are contacts to the MASH. They're not all referrals to children's social care. So some of them may be requests for information, so they are all counted. But it does place a very large demand. So the levels are between 5,000 and 6,000 per quarter contacts. So it's a very considerable operation. We have reissued our thresholds, the threshold documents to our partners. We're working with individual agencies to improve their understanding of thresholds. We have a consultation line within the MASH, so that is available to partners to discuss any cases where they're uncertain of whether it meets the threshold. That's particularly well used by schools. So there are, as I mentioned, the additional triage, which has started with the police this week to look at the number, because that is, as you'll see in the document, the largest source of contacts to the MASH. So there's a considerable amount of work going on to work with partners to help them understand the threshold and direct their cases in a better way, perhaps the early help services where that would be more appropriate.
Yes, please. When anybody phones in to MASH, is that a service that is instantly answered, or is that sometimes not manned and therefore causes a delay?
I'm glad you asked that, because one of the issues raised was the complex process by which members of the public or partner agencies had to actually get through to the MASH. So it went through the council contact point and then to the MASH. the operators from contact service have moved into the MASH, so they come in directly. We've also initiated a direct line for anybody who wants to make an urgent child protection referral. So that has been instituted in the last 2 months. And the feedback we're getting from partners is very positive about both of the direct lines, that's the consultation line and the child protection line, and we're also getting positive feedback about that the service is smoother for the vast majority of calls, and we're processing them much more quickly.
Does that mean that the line is always manned for people to get through on, or office hours? But it's something that people can always get through on, or is there still a staffing issue that people can't get through?
The main MASH is they're all always staffed. Sometimes schools have reported back about the consultation line that they find it difficult to get through because it's engaged. In the past, I have to say that's sometimes because schools have been using it as a sort of central contact point, so they've not been using it, and so we've done a lot of work with schools to sort of say only use this line for appropriate calls. And as I said, the feedback I've had recently from head teachers in particular has been much more positive, and so that's the feedback I've had. So yes, the main line is always staffed through office hours.
Councillor Khan, please.
The factor of thresholds is an interesting one because, of course, you know, various partners, their threshold for accessing the service may vary. And I'm thinking particularly, I was at panel the other day and there was a child who had been referred to CAMS, had been seen, and then the case was closed. This was a case where the foster parents were trying to do a really good job with this child. Wonderful foster parents, I have to say. Ian, the issue of CAMS in the partnership and the threshold, and I can imagine there must be social workers who have a child who say this child needs to be referred to CAMS. Where is that relationship now? Because CAMS were given additional funding not so long ago, and the implication was suggested of that was that they would be able to take on more referrals. Now, in amongst the children that are looked after children by us, as an authority, where does that issue stand? How easily are they able to access CAMS?
I think there are two aspects to that. One is the general CAMS, and one is the specific CAMS for looked after children. I suppose the funding for CAMS overall, and beyond CAMS, mental health services for children, because the local transformation plan is aimed at a range of preventative services at different levels, as well as the children who are requiring a service from the SLAM Commission service. So funds where there was additional funding from the CCG, and there was additional funding also from NHS England to support the transformation plan. I think that it is still short of the amount in comparable authorities, but it is a significant improvement, and waiting times, for example, have significantly improved. It hasn't generally changed the threshold, but by the reduction in waiting times and an improvement in the levels of non-attendance, so it's a more effective service, so more children are receiving it. It's still not where I think we would collectively want the service to be. In terms of the looked after children's service, That's a specifically commissioned service for looked after children that gives them a much shorter waiting time. Yes, there's a service level agreement. Again, I don't have the figures off the top of my head, but the numbers of children not given a service is low, and generally the reasons are around geography, or there's very few cases. I mean, I'd be interested to know the case that you're referring to, Councillor Khan. I'm happy to look into it and the reasons for it.
One of the things that used to come up in those discussions at times was, well, the child needs to be more settled before we intervene. Well, I can't imagine, how to interpret that, because a child who's being looked after has clearly had a bit of a traumatic journey to get to where the child is now. So, yes, I would be very interested to hear how much further on we are on that front. Thank you, Ian.
Yes, historically there's always been a real issue with that, and the sort of catch-22 that particularly looked after children find themselves in. They had to be in a stable placement to get to be in a stable placement. They had to address their issue. I think that's much less of an issue now. I mean, I think that argument does hold for if you want to think about long-term psychotherapy, then it would be rash to enter into some very long-term forms of treatment if you know a child is about to move imminently. But that's not a typical reason to. There are a range of services that are offered to children and foster carers that are not dependent on the child being in a stable placement.
Doesn't it? It helps the foster parents, and it helps to sustain that placement and perhaps not another move for that child. All those are. Anyway, you're the professional. I'm just raising the issues.
We did say, actually, we had a high risk of missing children. Could you give us a bit more information on that and how we deal with it? And I'm sure we've got lots of children for other boroughs, because we do seem to sort of, because our costs are possibly lower than central London anyway, etc. Could you give us a bit of detail on that, please?
We do have high rates of children going missing, and something of that is referred to towards the end of the report. So we do have the highest levels of children going missing in London. That's partly we're a large place in our population, but it is a principal factor is the number of looked after children living in Croydon, and looked after children are more likely to be reported missing than children who are living at home, because there will be procedures that are followed by either their foster carer or the residential staff. So that does mean that they get reported to a higher degree. But we do have large numbers. There is a regular missing panel, which is a multi-agency panel which monitors children. Each child who is going missing has been missing for more than 24 hours. There will be a strategy meeting which is convened looking at those specific issues, and that will potentially escalate the case to thinking about publicity, etc. We have a daily missing report which goes to all managers across early help and children's social care, so that managers are able to see all of the children who are currently reported missing, and that's so that they can take steps to ensure that what we have agreed to and what plans are in place to try and find and locate those children are taking place, but also to ensure that the information is still up to date and that some children have been, if they've been located, that's put back, that information is shared. There's the Quality Assurance Manager for CSA and Missing also does a 6-weekly summary report providing sort of summary information. So there's a great deal of information which is shared. We have 2 commissioned services undertaking return home interviews for children who, when they do return home, so that there is an independent person who asks them the reasons for having gone missing in the first place, and undertakes an issue of whether they feel safe in their current placement. The take-up for that is generally around 50%, so about 50% of children decline the offer. It's targeted at the children that we're most concerned about. And we're also undertaking training for social workers to be doing return home interviews, so that they will do return home interviews on each other's cases. In some cases, it's best that it's the allocated social worker who undertakes them because of the strength of the relationship. It's important that it's somebody who's not directly associated in the provision of the placement, and that's part of the guidance around missing children. But so there's does that assist?
That's very helpful. I mean, are some of these children from other boroughs that sort of are wanting to go back to where they've come from and things like that? I mean, do you find you make connections in that way as well?
Some of them are. We don't, for children placed by other authorities, the agreement is that that authority would undertake the return home interview for their children. Most of the children, I think, it's less that they want to return home. They're often placed in Croydon because they have a range of behavioural and emotional difficulties, and they're going missing for different reasons. Some of them are they may be at risk of sexual exploitation. They may be involved in gangs issues, or some of it is more about less risky behaviours, but things around social life and going out.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. Councillor Fitzsimons.
Page 18 and 19, our vision and the focus of our work. And I note at the bottom of page 19, it talks about the fact that this has been circulated to staff and there'll be a further launch session later in March. And what is quite, what I'd like to sort of ask about this is, as you know, I quite like strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and strengths as a way of trying to decide where we're doing better or where we need to improve. And taking the two, the first one and the second, of those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bullet points, which one would you say that we're doing the best at? And which one is the area that we need to do the most work? And then again on the focus of work, looking at either practice, workforce, performance management and partnership working, of those 4, which one do you think over the next year is the area that is most needed, if you can actually make those choices?
Okay, thanks for that question. Very good question. I think that if I had to pick one where there's evidence of our success, that would be about supporting families to care for their children where safe to do so. I suppose the evidence for that is in the numbers of our looked after children excluding unaccompanied asylum seekers, has, over the past 3 years, still gone down slightly. And it's in the last 2 years, it's probably been pretty much flat. And so I think there's evidence of considerable work to help families to keep their children where that's safe, and to return them when that's safe. So I think that's probably, at the moment, our strongest. I think that probably I'd certainly want to improve the level of engagement with our children and young people, and I think that's not been overall a strength, not just within the children's social care, but also across the partnership. And that's, I think there's a great deal of work, but we have not been good at bringing it together and compiling it and really showing that we've taken action on the basis of what they've told us. But I think that going back to where we were talking about pressures of demand, we are struggling to work with our partners to make sure that children receive the help at the right time and and early enough to divert them from needing a specialist service within children's social care. And again, I think that's the evidence for that is what we discussed about earlier about the pressure on our on the children's social work service and the large rise in numbers of allocated children in need. Ideally, those children should have had their needs met within our collective partnership early help services.
So the focus on our work, would you say that because you've got practice, workforce, performance management or partnership working, is it the last one or?
I think that probably my first concentration has been on the top one, and it's been about improving the practice, improving what we do on a daily basis with children and families to meet their needs, to have a clear assessment of their needs that they understand, a clear plan of work. And a clear and that we review whether that work is being effective and achieving what it needs to do. And I think that if you ask me where I've concentrated my attention in the last 3 or 4 months, that's where I've been concentrating my attention and the attention of my senior management group, especially within children's social care.
Councillor Rendell.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sean. Just on the back of that and referring to the 10 messages on what we need from professionals, I see that's gone out to staff, which is great. How are we going to make sure that's put into practice? And also, importantly, what are we going to do to make sure that those things are happening? And sort of on the back of that, if we can do those things, which sound very sensible, going to the return home interview, if you've got a young person with a lot going on, if you offer a return home interview, that all sounds a little bit formal and a little bit scary, and you said 50%, we've got a 50% take up. If they don't take it up, are we finding out the information that we would find from an interview through other means? And that comes back to us building a relationship with those 10 needs from the professionals that maybe we can find the information that we need, but not necessarily through what would come across as a very formal, maybe scary return home interview. So sort of 2 questions in one ramble, I'm afraid.
So the first question was how will we know? I mentioned in the introduction the improvement board and the 6 work streams that are within that. So obviously there's 4 sections here, 6 work streams, because we've also got early help and the MASH as more probably task and finish unfinished groups in the sense that early help is never quite finished, but there are specific tasks around early help and the MASH. And in a way, one of the key things around how we know is our performance management and how that relates to practice development. We've been doing a considerable amount around our data set and our use of data, and driving forward a performance management culture between throughout the managers, sharing information, giving challenge where that's needed, and a much clearer set of targets. And I think that the way in which the Practice Development Group is working, and working with staff particularly, is relating that back to individual children and children's outcomes, rather than statistics are important, but practice and the experience of children is what we need to do. And so the other bit about how we know is the other parts of quality assurance, and I mentioned Practice Week, where we are able to see upwards of 100 children, where senior managers are going out with social workers and with staff from Early Help and Youth Offending Service to observe their work, as well as looking at the records, talk to children, talk to families, get their experience, and so a much more 360-degree understanding of what we're doing well and what we're doing and what we still need to work on. You mentioned the retirement home interview. I mean, many of those children will still who refuse will still be known to us. They'll still be looked after very often. So it's not that they won't have had any opportunity to speak to somebody. They may have refused a third person because some young people feel they've got all too many professionals in their life, thank you. Some of them will live at home, and therefore we will know less about their reasons for having refused. But it isn't, I mean, the staff that undertake these, they're from the NSBCC and they're from CFR London. They are skilled at working with young people. They are persistent. It isn't just one call that's followed up with texts, it's followed up with efforts, to other considerable efforts to engage the young person. But if a 16-year-old person is telling you in no uncertain terms that they don't want to speak to you, well, at some point you have to listen to that's their view as well, and that has to be respected.
I want to have a look at the adoption figures that you talk about that, which you're probably not too surprised about. There's a couple of things. Obviously, you highlight in particular that London overall performs quite a lot worse in terms of its adoption rating than other around the country. I'm interested to know why London in particular, the wider area, has that concern, and if that's something that's going to be addressed by the regionalisation side of it. Secondly, even it says Croydon still performs badly even within London. Or the suggestion is that. And one of the particular areas, we've got an awful lot of children that have had a place an order, but if you're not being matched, is there a particular reason behind that?
I think the reason for London's relative underperformance, I mean, the particular underperformance is it's expressed as a percentage of the numbers of children leaving care overall. And so that's children who are leaving care as 18-year-olds. And so I think the context of London is slightly different to the other parts of the country. I mean, the National Adoption Leadership Board hasn't really gone into the reasons for regional differences. Within London, we have the London Adoption Board, which I happen to be chair of, and we do look at data and relative data. And there are differences of performance within London. Some of them may be socio-economic reasons. But it's quite hard to, and in a way, that's one of the motivations for the United Kingdom government to look at regionalisation, because they've been generally concerned about very different outcomes in different authorities and different levels of performance, and so they're concerned that some children in some authorities get a lower chance of being adopted than in other authorities. So that's part of their drive and part of the motivation. Will the Regional Adoption Agency solve that for London? I believe it will go some way to doing that. I think it will. We're still scoping out the proposals around a regional adoption agency, so we'll still have to look at some of the figures before coming to a final conclusion. But at the moment, we have 33 London authorities, all doing matching and all seeking adopters from within the same pool, plus another 10 voluntary adoption agencies. So we've got 43 adoption agencies seeking adopters for children with additional needs, because generally those are the ones, so it's some children with disabilities, but also thereby additional needs. Children who are part of a sibling group, and therefore there are additional needs in terms of looking after more children. And then children from minority ethnic backgrounds who don't have additional needs, but it's over the general population, but the matching is more difficult because there's a smaller pool of adopters. So I think it will rationalise our ability to plan the recruitment of adopters. And it will also rationalise our arrangements for adoption support. So in having better arrangements for adoption support, it becomes more possible for people to think about taking on additional challenges, and so it potentially becomes more attractive to adopt. I think overall it's probably marginal, the actual numbers that would increase within London of benefiting from adoption. I think it's more likely to improve in the amount of time it takes to place children and the quality of the experience. You asked about the Croydon performance. The Croydon performance, again, is expressed as the proportion of the numbers of children leaving care, and our performance has been always looked very poor because the numbers of our children leaving care includes unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. So more than 55% of our care leavers are unaccompanied children who were never going to be adopted because they're of the age at which they arrived in the United Kingdom. So that's a slight caveat to our performance. Historically, our performance on timeliness has been wanting, and again, 4 years ago, our performance on the numbers of children was very poor. We have caught up in terms of the numbers of children as a proportion of our local population with the rest of London, and we've caught up considerably in the timeliness of children having plans established and being placed for adoption. Did I get some more?
The only other area in particular was obviously the number of children that we've had from orders to place for adoption and then that we're still waiting placement, when we're actually not actively recruiting adopters except for specific types of adopters. Is that those two facts connected, or from inside?
I don't believe they are. I don't believe they are connected. We have a larger pool of adopters than anybody else, certainly in the South London Consortium. We are not actively recruiting, and I think that comes back to the issue about the Regional Adoption Agency. The history of adoption recruitment, nationally, we've had a picture of a very large glut of adopters. So there was a huge amount of recruitment on the 4 to 5 years ago when the government was very keen that more children would be adopted. That did increase. There were then case laws that reduced the numbers of children So what happened was that agencies, both voluntary and local authority adoption agencies, had recruited too many people. A lot of people got extremely frustrated. And then actually, nationally, then adoption agencies have pulled back on recruitment. And there is some evidence from voluntary adoption agencies that nationally we're heading for a shortage. We have been monitoring the numbers across London. In London, the number of adopters seems to be in a better position than it does nationally. But the reason for regionalisation means that you rationalise those decisions around individual agencies recruiting. As I say, our pool in Croydon is actually larger than any of our South London consortium partners.
Councillor Khan.
Ian, the regionalisation of adoption services. I have a query in my head. Can bigger be better? Given the very personal nature of the service, both for children and for adults and becoming families.
I guess maybe Councillor Ian will, I'm sure, come in because on many levels he's got far more expertise in this than I have, chairing the London board. But I would say yes, bigger can be better. You've just heard Ian say that we've got 33 different London boroughs all recruiting from basically the same pool of people and actually for the same group of children. And we must be able to do that better. Because it is a very small number of children that we're talking about. So if you look at the figures in here, you know, they're not high numbers across the whole of London. So we're not looking at some giant monolith. And within that, the good social work practice is always very individualised. So I would say yes. In terms of where we are in the process, just so that I can remind you in that, a report went to Cabinet and it was signed off that we agreed the principle of exploring joining the regionalisation of adoption, and we have to report back to get Cabinet to make the decision for the final stage if that's what we recommend. Yeah, so I'm just, whilst you may remember it, Councillor Khan, as you take a sharp interest, I thought it may be helpful for the whole of the committee just to be reminded, I'm sure Councillor Henson knows it too, but just to remind people where we are within that process. So we haven't yet made a decision, but we've taken an in-principle decision that we support the exploration of that. At the last count, at the last regional meeting I was at Directors of Children's Services, I think it was 24 local authorities had formally signed up to say they wanted to be part of those arrangements. Oh, there we go.
So it's 26 now. I'm sorry?
I can... where I was, there are two authorities who have chosen not to be part of it because they're on the edge of London and linking into arrangements that they feel suit their current arrangements more than pulling into London.
Councillor Fitzsimons, please.
I'm just going to, just really one point, which is just a follow-on from a point Ian made earlier about engagement. I know on page 35 of the report on 10.9, there's a number of bullet points, but you know, as you said, one of the bullet points that Alison Murphy, in her sort of pre-review or external review, it was develop a coherent strategy for the engagement of children and families and how their voices shapes service provision. And I mean, I note that you say this, that you know that this is something that we need to do more on. and I note that we've got it in our sort of vision. But when I read, I just had a quick check again through the paper, and I think it's sort of clear that it's something that we know we need to do, but I can't see that there are many other references through the rest of the paper. And as scrutiny has one of its roles about giving a voice to people who receive services, or I just wondered whether you would welcome maybe some help or support from scrutiny from that area. I'm not saying that we would lead on it, but it does seem that it's an area that some work needs to be done on. Obviously, I don't know what your plans are over the next year or something, but it may be something that if you would welcome scrutiny help on that, that maybe it's something that we could consider in next year's work programme if the committee is interested in about how we, whether there's some pre-decision scrutiny that could be done in terms of this sort of strategy of engagement of children and young families.
I mean, I would certainly welcome. I mean, I think the more help that we can get, I'd welcome any of it. I think. I mean, I can talk a little bit more about what we are doing. I think Barbara may want to. Do you want to say something about the restructure?
So I think Ian knows I'm almost on one of my hobby horses here, but I think it's a helpful context to add. I think it's a really helpful offer, but I wonder whether we might want to take a slightly wider view. You'll know that we've just established a new director's post, which is the Director of Education and Youth Engagement. And that's partly because I really want to make the youth engagement and the voice of young people much louder and stronger, and to do the things that Ian described earlier around driving and shaping what we do. So as David Butler, you know, has been successful and is recruited into that post, it's now his third day in post, so or maybe fourth today. But one of the things I want him to do is to develop a clear strategy around youth engagement and youth voice. Now, clearly, we don't want to miss out on some of the very detailed specialist and targeted services that sit under Ian's part of the world. And so we haven't yet developed any of those. You'll know that you can see that we're still at an early stage. But we would want to maybe try and get something that was coherent and reached across. And I think it would potentially be a really strong pre-scrutiny item.
Perhaps we could have that in the second half of next year's calendar, you know, an update from him. He could perhaps come, whatever, you know, we could consider that anyway now. Yeah. Well, thank you very much indeed. I think, you know, you do seem to be moving on, making progress from the stage you're at, and I do have huge numbers. And I can see, and I'm sure you can see from us as well, that you are very, very committed and really keen to do the very best, as Barbara's introduction said, for our children, as are we. And that's why there have been so many questions, really. But thank you very much indeed. Did you want to just finally say something?
Yeah, I'd really like to say that as councillors, these papers are reflecting, you know, the huge responsibility that our social work staff carry and the day-to-day situations that they meet up with, and that we, as a council, as corporate parents, have expectations of. Yet they're at the coalface. They're making those day-to-day decisions, and they're looking after our children to the best. Of course, and these papers really reflect, even I reading them, you know, I think, oh, that's, you know, that's an idea. Yeah, I hadn't thought that this was the model of practice that was around. And I have to say, I'm really impressed. And I really do want to thank our social workers, because they probably don't get thanked too often with the situations they face on a daily basis. But I would would like to say a huge appreciation for the work, the incredible work they do. Okay? And I'd like that passed on to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Conn. I know you're not easily impressed in this world, so we take it deeply, and thank you to Ian. Yeah.
It has to be said, Barbara. Okay? Thank you.
Okay, thank you then. Can we move on to the next item then? Item 7, 0 to 25 send service. And we have Barbara, I think.
Well, we have.
Presentation.
I mean, again, we
Yes.
have a. Are you going to do it as a presentation?
Yes.
So does that? Are the people up there? Oh, marvellous. So we'll have to wait for our able technical assistants to get the presentation up. Some of you will know, just to set the context, is that our 0 to 25 disability team moved over into adult services towards the end of last year. I would have to say this is my third attempt, and hopefully third time lucky, to actually build an all-age disability service, which is really about reflecting the ages and stages that people are at, which are not necessarily defined by their chronological age. And I think there is never more important than within this group of children, young people and adults that we work with. And our long-term relationship that we have as a council with these young people as they grow, as they mature, and with their families and carers, are probably one of the ones where you asked earlier, Councillor, about the stability of our relationship. But these are a group of children and adults who are generally fairly well defined, and generally a group of people who throughout their lives we will touch and support in some way. Hence my sort of passion and desire to have an all-age service. Now, obviously, our legislation doesn't necessarily help us, and we have children's legislation and adults' legislation, but let us not let that get in our way. So I'm delighted that we appointed Alison Farmer, who is still fairly new into post, and hopefully she will take you through at a fairly high level what is some quite complicated legislative changes, but will actually stick with the principle and the vision and our hope and aspiration for this particular group of young people.
Thank you. So this is a brief report, and it's in the context of the Children with Disabilities Service and the SEN Service being joined together last April, and then becoming part of the All-Age Disability Service from the 1st of November. So it's a brief update in that regard. And what it covers is the context, some of the outcomes we're aiming for, some of the progress we've made to date, and the benefits that we're still working on. And I welcome questions on all of that. So we have on the first slide the vision, and this vision has come from the managers within the service who are passionate about the direction of travel and keen to make things work for the children and young people of Croydon, and in particular to help them achieve outcomes in or near their local community, and enable them to be confident and resilient, and to be able to maximise the use of their local community assets. And like, just as Ian has indicated, the voice of the young people is something that we want to have at the heart of practice and is still an area for development. The development of this service, as Barbara indicated, was predicated by change in law and the introduction of the Children and Families Act and the Care Act, where personalisation, preparation for adulthood and outcomes were all critical to the direction of travel. And alongside that legislative change, what Croydon has seen is an increase in demand, which may be attributable to the change in legislation, or it may be attributable to the increase in population. And it may be attributable to a general rise in complexity of SEN across the country, probably due to medical advances. So I suspect that that's to do with all of those things. The context of these changes and increase in demand are, we've called it a financial squeeze, but that means trying to do more for no more money, which means less money for each child. And I can talk to that if that's helpful. And there is an introduction of a local area inspection, which we anticipate at some point, we don't know when, and which we are endeavouring to prepare for. And that inspection will look at how well we identify children's special educational needs, how well we assess and provide for the, young people with special educational needs and disabilities, and what the outcomes are. Now, this is the context here in terms of demand for SEN services on the next slide, which shows that we have currently, it's just under 2,500 children with either a statement of SEN or an EHC. And that is an increase over, I'm not quite sure what period of time, but a relatively short time. Not so long ago, there were 1,800 children. So that is quite a significant increase. So that's actual numbers. I'm not doing percentages, so you can see the difference. And the 11,000 children that are referenced underneath the children with statements or EHC are those children who are being provided with support in schools at what's called SEN support level under the new legislation, was previously School Action Plus, so a lower level of need, not provided, not maintained, who don't have a plan maintained by the council. The areas of need that Croydon has, the different areas of need that the children in Croydon have, are illustrated above, and as you can see, again, very similar to national profile, autistic spectrum disorder is way and above the highest level of need. With in Croydon, moderate learning difficulties being the next level, that isn't necessarily typical of other boroughs. Behaviour, emotional and social difficulties, it's not, under the new legislation, it's called social emotional mental health, is the third area in Croydon. And then speech, language or communication difficulties. And that's not typical, that's not atypical from other areas. The task that we have in terms of the Children and Families Act and the implementation of that legislation, which is over a 3-year period up to April 2018, is to transfer all statements of SEN to education, health and care plans and all learning difficulty assessments to EHC plans. So I'm just sorry on the previous slide, we've actually completed 70% of the transfers of statements and have 1/3 left to go, which is pretty much in line with the timescale, and we are planning on completing those transfers within timescale. On the next slide, we've set out some outcomes which we think will define what success will look like. So a positive experience of special educational needs and disabilities, education, health and care needs assessment, and social care assessment and reviews for children with disabilities, and transfer, some practical mechanics, transfer of all LDAs and statements of SEN within the timescale. Positive outcomes for children, young people and their families. We are more outcome focused, and the outcomes we're expecting are that young people achieve independence wherever they can, and employment in or near their local community, and effective preparation for adulthood, which relates to the positive outcomes. We have made some progress. So some of the progress is in terms of organisation of the service. So we've got co-location of SEN and Children with Disabilities team, and we've got an integrated leadership team. We are on track with the transfers of statements of SEN, as I referenced earlier, and there is a provision of development, local provision for children, specialist provision for children with SEN, that is aligned to enabling young people to achieve outcomes in or near their local community. So tonight there is actually a consultation meeting at St Nicholas Primary School in regard to the increase in places with 2 additional classes per year group planned and a building programme committed to by the council. In regards to that, Redgate's 2 additional classes, which in essence are bulge classes, and the Backmead family of schools is increasing with 14 places for vulnerable children, but overall increasing to 251 places for children with either autism and social emotional mental health needs or both. We recently heard that LB Croydon has been allocated the highest allocation for London boroughs of 2.9 million for capital investment in special schools. We're trying to establish whether that is separate and different from the bid that we've made, which we think it is, the bid we've made for a new free special school for autism, because that wouldn't cover it. I think we heard about 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, we got the 2.9, which is actually over a 3-year period. Within the capital programme that has been to Cabinet in July last year and I think January this year, there were identified a number of priorities of which we've already allocated, Croydon has already allocated resources. There are other areas which we haven't yet identified and allocated resources, which include post-16 provision, for which 2.9 would be extremely helpful. We're looking at wanting to make progress in terms of pathway design, and that means developing pathways in particular post-16 and into adulthood. At the moment, those are being pieced together, if I put it that way. And what we want is that that's more coherent and better communicated so that parents and young people feel confident they know what's going to happen next on the pathway from education into either adult care or independence. And so that's a big piece of work to do. And in terms of progress to date, the youth services continues to be well received. I know that they're well recognised by councillors, but we've had some very positive feedback by a parent here just recently saying how their youth services had completely transformed a young person's life and enabled them to have a social life when they hadn't previously had a social life. So that's all good news. The risk and issues is just a small line, but actually it's a rather big line, and that is around funding, because the end of this financial year, the forecast was, we will have an overspend of 4.25 million in the high needs block. And although there is a rebaselining, which means that going forward, for the coming year, 17-18, we're forecasting coming within budget. Of course, there is a historic 4.25 million overspend that will need to be addressed over time. So that is a risk. The benefits are some of the things that we've covered already, but I just wanted to identify some again and reiterate them, and these are all in progress. The expansion of local provision, so increased specialist places in Croydon, and development of post-19 local transition pathways will be a benefit. Improved performance and casework. Some of that is aligned to the sort of improvements that Ian was referencing in regard to social work overall. Things that I would target in particular are timely reviews and responding to those reviews effectively, so that if there are changes needed in a young person's plan, those are applied in a more timely way. The next target area that we're working on benefit is co-production. We want to work more closely with our parent groups, and with that in mind, we are in the process of setting up a parent reference group so that we can have more strategic planning with our parents, and there can be a better dialogue, and so that we can be more responsive and the communication's improved. Improved decision making, equitable and transparent, resource allocation that is perhaps more obviously equitable, and that decision making is made in a more joined up way. So where currently we've got panels which are separate for disabled children and for SEN, we'd like to be joining those up more so that the decision making around a young person's plan is more holistic. The local offer is an absolute priority in terms of development. The local offer at one level is a website where you communicate information about what's available locally, both across the third sector, communities, council services, schools, health, and adult services. At the moment, the website parents' report is not very user-friendly, and we want to make it much more accessible, user-friendly, so that within 3 clicks you can get to something that you want, and you can do that very easily by areas of need, by age range. So that's something we're prioritising in terms of next steps. And again, I've talked about pathway redesign, but it's really sort of joining on with Barbara's point about the vision. We want young people and their families to have a plan for life, or to be supported in planning for life, and that's something we're working on. And again, there's workforce development that needs to happen so that we can work differently in a more person-centred way with a greater focus on outcomes.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. It's very comprehensive. Could I take questions then, please? Councillor Bird and then Councillor Henson.
Thank you. With all the 70% of the statements going over to the Educational Healthcare Plan, how's that impacting on new healthcare plans that might come onto the scene? Is that something that having to take second place, or are they being kept up to date as well?
That is a very good question. The capacity of the service to be able to address both the transfers and the new requests, to manage that, it has been a challenge, and it is a challenge. We did get additional funding, and we have recruited additional education, health and care plan coordinators in order to address transfers, and that's how we've been able to stay on track. We do currently have a significant number of assessments going through. So we are still on target with completion of education, health and care plans, new assessments within 20 weeks, but we are on about 95% within 20 weeks. We will be challenged to keep that up over this coming year because we do have a very significant number, and it will be easier to manage once the transfers have been completed.
Afterwards, I can't remember who it was said now. Councillor Henson, I think it was next. Yes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, I think I better make a small declaration of the terms of about to work the speech and language department, and that's an area my family have had to get leave with. My son's had speech and language delay. You were just talking about that when you said that that's not atypical. Was it just the speech and language area that you were talking about not being atypical, or were you referring to the whole makeup of the demand for the different services?
In terms of when I referenced the speech and language communication, it was in the context of the pattern of need overall in Croydon. So that the main area that I would say is atypical in the Croydon pattern of need would have been the moderate learning difficulty. I'm surprised that that's second. I would have expected speech and language communication to be second. But the way that needs are categorised can vary, and partly can be driven by the provision of some of your specialist schools. So if you've got a specialist school which is designated as being for moderate learning difficulties, sometimes that can drive your identification of that area of need, and I suspect that's probably what's happened.
Sorry, just coming back. And so you're saying that it's more a case where we've got more likely to have a higher number of moderate learning difficulties people accessing that service than there being less people accessing the service of the speech and language department, or the other way around?
Sorry, I had my microphone on before and I shouldn't have done. I'm not quite sure I've understood the question. So is it in relation to the speech and language therapy service?
No, I'm just saying, is it, so you said that you're surprised that moderate learning difficulties is the second highest. Are you saying that's because there's more people accessing that service, or there's less people accessing other services that you might have considered expected to be higher?
So these are about areas of need. How many children do we have with each area of need? And
So what I'm saying is that a case of the fact that the moderate there is more people needing the moderate learning services, or there's less people needing other services than you'd expect?
I would say, Alison, or going to do, I think it's more people, it's not needing it, but identified as. Having a moderate learning disability. you would generally not see it as high as it is here in Croydon. I think that, you know, you might use the word an outlier. When you look at our data, what doesn't look like a normal set of data for us. You know, if you take people's figures, they'll all vary a little bit, but that's the one when I looked at it, and Alison's got more detail than me, but when I looked at it, you think, that doesn't feel like a standard pattern you would expect to see. So it's not necessarily saying it's a need, it's the identification and classification. Okay. And I think Alison tried to give an explanation that if we have a school that's good it does moderate learning difficulties, you might feel more identification, and that might be the explanation as to why it looks atypical. Does that? Yeah? Does that make sense? Let's stop while the let's stop while the going's good.
Councillor Rendell, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the report, Alison. Couple of quick questions. Looking at the primary needs on the list, can I make sure that when we are planning forward that we've got more in-depth detail, specifically looking at comorbidity, because moderate learning difficulties, you probably have for those are probably on the spectrum as well. Same with behavioural emotional. So I want to make sure that we're working with a much bigger set of data when we're planning forward. The main thrust of my question is regarding EHCPs, because I've got anecdotal evidence from in Croydon and across the country that in primary schools, smaller settings, children seeing the same teachers every day, a child has a special educational need, the primary schools can be better at putting in, say, an individual education plan and helping that special educational need within the school setting. Then, of course, when the child then goes to secondary school, are we seeing a spike in EHCPs? And I know it was some data I did ask for. So a spike in EHCPs being applied for in the early years of secondary school. And do we need to be, even though children are being catered for within primary schools under an IEP, for example, do we need to do more work in saying we still need to get that EHCP done, because it will take you all the way up to 25? And so,
I haven't got here, but the pattern of EHCs by age, and I could have included it, but I didn't. But I can provide it subsequently, and it will be published through the SEN2 data, which we're just completing currently. My reflection on your question around do we see a spike in requests post-transfer to secondary is actually generally we see a spike pre-transfer to secondary, quite often in years 5 and 6, and that's generally, in my experience, fuelled by anxiety about whether needs will be met in secondary. And some of that we might say is legitimate, because the child may well be able to manage and make progress in the context of a smaller environment where they have one adult mainly that they have a relationship with their class teacher, and that can be very much harder if you're a young person with learning difficulties in an environment where you have to make relationships with lots of teachers and there's a busier environment. It makes sense. And so people prepare for that by requesting an education, health and care plans, or needs assessment, which sometimes isn't successful because actually the young person has made good progress in primary, i.e. there's no point in undertaking an assessment when a young person has made good progress with the support that they already have. And so that sometimes can be challenging for parents when that happens. I'm not sure whether that answers completely, but it gives a bit of an insight into what we experience in terms of the pattern of requests for EHC needs assessments.
I mean, because we're talking before about workload, I mean, I get a lot of parents come to me, young children, and think, oh, an educational health care plan would be good, and the school's saying, oh, we're meeting the needs, and a lot of times saying, well, you go for the EHCP, because as I said, it is taking up to 0 to 25. It is taking up to 25. I'm just wondering, would it be better if we are trying to spread this across the age groups would be better for us as a council and better for the families as well.
My first point that education, health and care plans are always for those children with the most complex long-term needs, and generally I would expect those to be identified early, and for an education, health and care needs assessment to be result in a plan which does last for most of that child's education, not always, but mainly, i.e. there are fewer later requests, because generally children with most complex needs have their needs identified earlier, or they should do. So that would be my sort of first point. One of the things we are seeing currently, which we wouldn't have done previously, is that we're receiving more requests for young people in the post-16 age range. And I think that is, again, potentially about either anxiety about transition into adult services and post-16, or an expectation of having provision that is marshalled, if you like, through an education, health and care plan into that transition to adults services, which has been introduced through the Children and Families Act. And some of those requests we aren't necessarily agreeing to, because it isn't necessarily the best thing to delay working through the process of transitioning to an adult service that is going to support a young person with independence in their adult life, if they don't actually need education going forward. So you can, does that make sense? So one of the issues with the new legislation and education, health and care plans is that while the legislation talks about 0 to 25, in reality, the majority of children and young people, you would expect those education, health and care plans to be ceased to maintain well before 25, because the education that they received up to 19 has helped them to achieve the outcomes that they're going to achieve through education, and the next step needs to be a coordinated plan and transition into adult services, which will either support them depending on their level of need. If they've got profound and multiple learning difficulties, they then need to transition into something which will help them gain some and gain and maintain some independence, i.e. in communication, for example, potentially into supported accommodation, and for some with capacity to be able to engage in a degree of employment or supported employment, it will help them to move into that. But it doesn't need to be education to do that. Does that make sense? And I think there are some expectations that a plan will go to 25. So we are ceasing to maintain some plans, and we are putting in place a programme of activities which transition in the year after education ends, 19 for example, and will be a bridge between education and adult services.
Lovely. Thanks very much. I would say that people I know through my network are concerned of the HCP stopping at, as you said, 19 and not going through to 25. So maybe that's some communications work that needs to be doing, that it's not going to just be a cliff edge, that something else will be put in place. I get what you're saying about the EHCP, because I mean, to apply for the EHCP, you just need a recognised statement that this child has got some sort of special educational needs. So I'm still not convinced that figure shouldn't be higher, to be honest, of the number of EHCPs. And I am concerned that, you know, as I say, the EHCP is taking you through a long period of time where, okay, this primary school, say, for example, oh, we're doing all right, you don't need the EHCP, and then maybe the secondary, oh, we're putting in place something, you don't need the EHCP, and then you're moving on. I think we need more looking at the length of time that the EHCP will cover someone.
Perhaps some reassurance could be given that if there was a need, that people would know that they could go back to that, and they could always, they're not just finished, as you say, on the cliff edge and going to crash down if they still have needs a little, you know, when they're 20 or 21. But you know that there's some, that there is a possibility that they can still go back if they really need it. Perhaps that might be all they needed, and then they'd give them the confidence to carry on. with their independence and, as you set them on that pathway. But perhaps that's what you're sort of saying, really, isn't it?
I'm just slightly worried that a school, because I know it's a lot of work and a lot of evidence he's given, and I'm sure we've all got cases ourselves where a school's not given enough or any information to an EHC. But I just want to confirm that that we aren't looking at blocks of a child's education. Oh, it's doing all right here, you don't need it. Oh, we're doing all right here, you don't need it. We are looking at that whole 0 to 25 period. Because I know anecdotally that sometimes that the HCPs are being refused because of, say, a primary school, as I said at the start, we're putting provisions in place, but what's going to happen in 2 or 3 years' time when you're in a completely different environment?
You're right, and I indicated that if a request for an education, health and care plan is made and a child's made progress, we don't agree to take the assessment forward, and that is what the legislation would indicate, because their progress indicates that their needs are being met with the support that they're receiving within school at that time. And while we might predict that they may or may not make progress in secondary, for example, when they're transferred, we don't know until it happens, and sometimes children do surprise us and make good progress. But the opportunity to be able to request again with new information that that indicates that things didn't work out, or that the support wasn't available, and as a consequence there is a need to carry out an assessment. Those cases are always reviewed again if a parent or a school comes back with more information and a request to reconsider the original request. That is always given a due consideration and all of the evidence looked at. That is absolutely, I can be assured of that. It doesn't mean to say that there are some challenges in some schools at some times. There are,
Sorry, very last point on this. I'm just wondering that would then happen when there may have been a complete breakdown in the education, and that there's more stress and more going on within the family, where we could have done it earlier in a much more easier way for the child and officers and the parents and the educators as well. That's why are we waiting until there's a crisis we need in the HCP and you still got to wait 20 weeks then? That's the point I'm getting at.
Thank you. Councillor Fitzsimon.
Thank you, Chair. Just want to look at the issue that was flagged up under the risks and issues, page 55, about the bid for new free special school. Because you read through the report and the £4 million overspend, and the fact that there is, so I mean, effectively explains that on page 60 that the plan is to address this through reduction reliance on independent, non-maintained sector placements and an increase in placements in local provision supporting independence in or near children and young people's local communities. I'm assuming, I'm making assumptions that, I'm aware that, transporting and especially schools that are significantly long distance from our boroughs can blow the budget very easily. And that sounds quite harsh, but when £4 million is a lot of money for a service to overspend, and I'm just trying to put it into context. If you're able to maybe give a little bit of insight into, in the sense of that a network of sort of independent provision has sort of grown up across sort of London with Croydon accesses. Are other London boroughs in similar situations where if they're relying on out of borough non-maintained provision, or are we particularly unique in that? And so I'm just really, because I don't know enough about the subject on a London basis. All I can see is the Croydon focus. So and then I'll come back once I get sort of some understanding on the London South East issue.
So in terms of London, and I've worked for 4 other London boroughs in the last 10 years, Croydon, the first thing I noticed was the level of expenditure in the independent non-maintained sector. It's considerably higher than other boroughs that I've been in. It isn't the only borough that's got an issue, and generally the boroughs have addressed the issue in a way that Croydon is currently doing, which is to develop its own provision locally and to reduce reliance. The transport bill for children is 8.5 million currently, and that wasn't included in the 4.5 million, the 4.25 million overspend, because that's only high needs block funding, which doesn't cover transport. But and if you look at Croydon, the pattern of Croydon's reliance on the independent non-maintained sector, it's pretty significant in the over 16 age range, which is why we need to develop those pathways locally. Croydon's a net exporter post-16. We're not doing very well at having a really good, robust offer locally that parents and young people have confidence in. And that is, I'll be honest, it's disappointing. We've got a regeneration opportunity to be able to provide supported employment locally, where we can get employers to commit to providing pathways for young people with disabilities, raise the profile of those young people. But you can only do that if you've got a really good post-16 education offer. And that is an area which I think we should prioritise and need to prioritise. And you'll get better value for money. And I'm going to give you an indication of what that might, why I say that. Over the period December and January, I undertook a moderation of the special school funding, which was reported to the High Needs Working Group. And consistently, the percentage of the budget spent on staffing within your special schools locally is generally between 82% and up to, I think, over 95% on staffing. And I think most of them are either 90% or plus on staffing, which is high. I generally expect it to be around about 85%. That's about right. 92%, 95% with a low carry forward is quite a challenge for sustainability. In the independent sector, it's not infrequent for us to find that only 74% is on staffing and 26% is on premises and on administration. And that's not good value for money. And so we do really want to look at having good value for money, really good or outstanding provision locally that provides those pathways. So I hope that gives you a bit of an indication. Croydon is not alone, but Croydon has a higher spend than I would have anticipated.
So, anecdotally again, you hear of people, friends and neighbours talking about children going to Sutton and other places. That's their sort of first choice, especially, as you said, post-16. What then does a potential provision in Croydon look like, or potentially feels like, if there's a vision for that? Because it's easy to say it's attractive, but I don't know enough about what really is an attractive post-16 provision that meets the needs and the aspirations of the children and the parents, or the carers.
There is a number of issues in the post-16 provision that I will sort of address at one time. So the first one is we need to improve our capacity with the most complex children with autism, challenging behaviour and learning difficulties. So we are quite challenged in that regard at the moment. And so we need to look at how we develop our model of provision for those young people. So they are some of the young people that we currently place out borough. Not out borough in the independent non-maintained sector. So those are children who are complex, and some of them may always have their needs met outside an independent sector, but more of them could have their needs met locally and ought to. We are not good at providing within our FE sector for the lower range of qualifications. So pre-entry level, entry level 1, with a proper pathway in that area, which is appealing and enables young people to really build up some basic skills and have a really supported pathway into employment with those basic skills. I'll give you a concrete example. There, we've got St Giles School, which I'm not sure whether people have visited, but it's for young people with physical, medical, sensory needs. And they've, young people, some of them have got very profound learning difficulties, some of them have got less profound cognitive difficulties, but clearly a complex range of medical and physical needs. Now, those young people, some of those young people, particularly the latter group that I've just referenced, could well have a pathway into the FE college at Croydon if we had better facilities there. So we've talked with Croydon and initially at FE College, and initially there they had some concerns about their level of expertise. But when you've got a school like St Giles who have the expertise, there's absolutely the opportunity for that school to provide the education input. But we don't have the infrastructure, i.e. the rooms, which have got hoists in them, have got a hygiene space. So we haven't got that facility and arrangement. We are working with the college on in regard to their current site to look to see whether we can provide that for not this coming September. They've been clear it would be too much of a challenge, but for next September. So that there is a real and genuine pathway from our own specialist schools into our own FE college, using the expertise that we already got. And that's a real opportunity. But that needs to be secured. And in the new site, those facilities would need to be there too. So that's sort of an area for development.
In addition of a new school, that's in addition to what we're doing, and what would the new school look and feel like in terms of, I don't know what song. I mean, I don't really know what it means in terms of numbers of children and how big it is. I mean.
So the bid that we've made is for a special free school for children with autism 2 to 19, between 120 and 150 children and young people, and again with a real focus on employment and pathways into employment and development of skills and independence, which will enable employability to be maximised. That if that was agreed, it would mean potentially looking at some of the ways in which our other provision in special schools is designated. But we have currently 189 children in the independent or maintained sector, a large number of whom will have a diagnosis of autism. So it would provide a better opportunity locally for those young people.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to, that has given me a lot more sense of what's both understand. I have a better understanding of where the money has been spent, yes, and the pressure that the council is under, and also potentially what a solution rather than just trying to manage the problem and trying to be more efficient. This is actually a fundamental. To me, this sounds much more like there's a chance of both helping those individual children get a better education and life outcome, which is what we are about, but also effective use of resources. So it seems to me that there's quite a lot to. I'm very pleased to hear these positive moves personally.
Thank you, Chair. I am really pleased that we have taken these issues up and are looking at a variance of a model and a continuation model rather than cut-off points which has been going on. I meet parents, and in fact, in my earlier career as a foster mother, I campaigned for a better model of provision and, creative models of provision for young people with special educational needs. So I'm really pleased to learn that we are, at last are taking up this issue and introducing a different model and a different pathway routes. The issues that I've come across, and I continue to come across, is that a young person has had special needs, gets to 16, gets to 17, things happen in the family, and ultimately this young person is then at home with a mother who may be quite depressed, the young person themselves getting depressed, and there being no journey on and out for them. I think it's very important that the colleges take on board this issue too. But I'm really excited and I'm really pleased to hear that we're doing a change of model on all of this, because it's long overdue, and it has to be an investment, because it empowers those young people ultimately to be making their choices rather than others making them for them. And so I'm really excited and I'm really pleased to hear this tonight. Thank you.
Councillor Bennett, please.
It was just to follow on from a previous question of Councillor Rendell's about the about the primary needs. It was just an observation. We've got 618 children on the autistic spectrum, but the children that's with speech, language and communication difficulties is 233. There's and you can have children on the autistic spectrum who have got speech, language and it's quite common for children on the autistic spectrum to have speech, language and communication problems. So what concerns me is that these children that are identified as having speech, language and communication difficulties, that they haven't got more complex. Because just to have that in isolation, where do you understand what I mean? What I'm saying, this which worries me, and if we drill down enough, or have these children been assessed properly or enough to find out exactly what's wrong with them? That was one question. And the other one was about the 750 statements of SEN to transfer to HC plans. Now, these are children that are going from sort of primary to senior and from senior post-16. Is this going to be any way the transition going to be a problem for them? Because they haven't got their... I mean, there won't be that many. There's not 750 children that are just about to go into transition, but there must be some, and it just concerns me that whether there will be a problem with their transition because they haven't got their EHC plans. So, but the first one was really an observation, carrying on from Councillor Rendell, about the primary need of these children. So it was... I mean, I know it's not something you probably can answer now, but it's just it concerns me that perhaps we haven't drilled down further enough to find out exactly what their need is. But if you could answer the other one, that would be good. Thank you.
Have a go at both. So in regard to if we're undertaking a transfer, a statement of SEN to an EHC plan, and will that affect other transitions which young people are going, particularly the primary to secondary? It's a big one, you're right, and post-16. We endeavour to make sure that we have done the transfer before post the secondary transfer, i.e. that the young person transitions from primary to secondary with an education, health and care plan rather than a statement of SEN. Some parents, choose not to go with the transfer when it is the time. They stick with the statement of SEN. It actually doesn't make any difference in terms of the child's rights and the approach. Other than an education, health and care plan perhaps is a little bit clearer. And so when you're consulting a secondary school, perhaps they've got a little bit more up-to-date information in the EHC plan. But I don't think that it does have a detrimental effect generally. I don't think we've got any evidence to suggest that. In regard to the issue that you've raised with regard to the areas of need and how they're defined, in the legislation, we do only record the primary area of need, but in the plan, the Education, Health and Care Plan or the Statement of SEN, the child's needs are defined in Section B if it's an EHC plan or Part 2 if it's a Statement of SEN, and they will be much more... it'll be a more comprehensive description, and then in the next section it will say how those needs have got to be met. But it's just what you record on any system is the primary area of need. Now, if we felt that it was an issue, you could agree to record the secondary area of need, because you're absolutely right. I mean, for example, there's a very well-documented evidence that a young person who might be identified with speech-language communication in primary age range, many of those young people, or some of those young people, if needs were being identified in secondary, they might be identified as social-emotional behaviour difficulties. Sometimes some of those young people with social-emotional mental health under the new legislation. And speech-language communication is less likely to be identified as primary area of need in secondary. It's just the nature of how that identification works. So you're right, it is a blunt instrument. But it's sufficiently robust in order to plan, I think, strategically what provision you need, because you have to take into account that these are only young people who generally would fall within the 2 to 3% of most complex needs, so inevitably they're not just going to have one just pure and simple need.
Okay, I think we've drilled down quite a bit. Thank you very much for your detailed information and things, and actually you've spurred us on to more and more questions. So thank you very much. I think it's been very, very helpful, and I'm sure we can come to you again. We can write in, can't we, and find out more, and etc. And of course, we'll have a report annually anyway. Do we? Not this one, no.
You're welcome to request future reports.
To have one, yes, if we need it, yes, annually. Okay, and thank you very much indeed, then. And so we're moving on to the work programme now. So it says request to turn the Wi-Fi off.